Hey guys, here's another question we've received. I have an American company that operates a satellite. Do I have to get an FCC license, or can I use Earth stations in another country and get licensed through that other country? Okay, so I'll start with a bit of background for folks who don't really know anything about how satellite communications work. The FCC, this is the Federal Communications Commission in the US. The FCC is the US agency that governs radio spectrum in the United States. And this is important because when people on Earth want to communicate with a satellite that's orbiting Earth, they tend to use radio waves to do that. The FCC has jurisdiction over those communications in either of two circumstances. First, when a space station transmits a radio signal that lands in the US, and it's then received by another radio receiver in the US. Or two, when an Earth station that's located in the US transmits a radio signal to a space station. Okay, so what do we mean by space station and Earth station? The first time that I heard the word space station in this context, I thought to myself, oh, they must be talking about the International Space Station or some other really big spacecraft that orbits the Earth and which people live on. But this isn't what the FCC is talking about when they use the word space station. In this context, space station means a piece of radio equipment that is in space and transmits radio signals. Similarly, an Earth station, which we also sometimes call a ground station, is a piece of radio equipment that is on the Earth and transmits radio signals. So if your company operates a satellite that isn't licensed through the US, you have to be concerned with the FCC jurisdiction only if your satellite transmits a radio signal that lands in the geographic territory of the US. Now, I found this concept really confusing at the time I first heard it because I said to myself, well, if there's a piece of radio equipment in space and it's transmitting a signal, wouldn't that signal almost always land in the US? And I had this misconception because I thought about things like AM and FM radio stations that I can listen to in my car. So for example, if I'm sitting in my car in San Diego, California, I can easily pick up AM and FM radio stations that are being transmitted from Mexico. And these signals aren't beamed in any particular direction. They're not beamed directly at me, of course. Instead, they blast out in all different directions. Ham radios, meanwhile, can transmit a radio signal in all directions for up to 4,000 miles. So you'd think that when a satellite transmits a radio signal and it's way up there in space, the radio signal might cover half the planet. And that if it's anywhere close to orbiting the US, the signal would certainly land in the US, even if you were using a ground station, say, in Argentina. Well, so that was a misconception. I wasn't quite right when I first learned about this stuff. First, satellites don't tend to transmit their signal in all directions like the way your local FM classic rock radio station does. Instead, they transmit their signals in a particular direction in a cone shape. This way, a satellite can direct its transmissions at a relatively small area of ground, and they won't unintentionally send signals to the United States while they're traveling over Canada. The second misconception that I had when I first learned about this topic is I assumed that a satellite would be transmitting a signal continuously. This would be a big problem if you had a satellite that was, say, in a polar orbit. Here's how a polar orbit works. So imagine this is the Earth, and that this little Lego Buzz Lightyear is a satellite. Here's what a polar orbit looks like. So imagine that you've got your satellite traveling like this, orbiting over the Earth, and it's moving as the world is turning. So as you can see, if it's moving in this kind of orbit, the satellite covers ground over the entire world. So it would always cover ground over the United States. And if it was transmitting continuously, it would always be transmitting in such a way that it was landing in the United States. So why would that not be a problem for polar orbits? So in actuality, satellites that are in polar orbits don't tend to continuously transmit. Instead, companies that operate satellites have prearranged Earth stations that they want to communicate with, and they transmit their signal only when the satellite is above one of these Earth stations. They also direct the signal at the Earth station when they're actually approaching the Earth station physically. When the satellite moves away from the targeted Earth station, the operators then turn off the transmission and wait for the satellite to move over another Earth station that they want to communicate with. In this way, satellite operators can choose which countries their radio signal is landing in, and they will know in advance which countries will try to claim jurisdiction over their activities. Otherwise, every country in the world might demand that every satellite operator pay them for a license to send radio signals from their satellites. So to wrap up, if you operate a satellite that sends out a radio signal, and you send a radio signal from that space station to the US, the FCC will have jurisdiction and require you to get an FCC license. If you don't send your signal to a location in the geographic US, then the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction. Okay, so that's where we draw the line with FCC jurisdiction. Now, the problem that a lot of companies face is that the FCC licensing process is incredibly difficult and expensive. It's much more so than a number of other countries. And as a result, a lot of companies choose other administrations to file through at the ITU, and they choose not to use US ground stations so that they can avoid having to get licensed through the FCC. Of course, this makes sense for companies that aren't US based. After all, if you're a German company, there's likely no reason that you'd want to go out of your way to fall under American FCC jurisdiction if you don't have ground stations in the US. But if your company is a US company, can you avoid FCC jurisdiction by simply not using US Earth stations and avoiding having your signal land anywhere in the US? Well, yes, you absolutely can do that. The fact that you have an American company does not mean that you must receive an FCC license to talk to your satellite. The regulations do not require that. Instead, you can do what we might call forum shopping. However, there are a few potential downsides to this. I've been told by people in the know that the FCC doesn't typically like it when American companies do this. And this could be a relevant consideration if you want your voice to be heard in the regulatory process. For example, there are instances in which the FCC has put out notices of proposed rulemakings and solicited comments from the public. And then there were some American companies who had participated in the forum shopping, and they had avoided FCC licensing, and those companies then wanted to respond to these notices. Other American companies who had interests that were adverse to those foreign shoppers, who themselves had gone through the FCC process, pointed this out in communications with the FCC and said, hey, don't listen to the opinions of those guys. They aren't even licensed by the FCC. They've done this forum shopping. They shouldn't have a voice. Now, whether that argument is valid or not is up for debate, but it's certainly worth mentioning. So, in conclusion, yes, you can avoid using US ground stations and you can get your satellite communications license through a country other than US and save a ton of time and money. But doing so might have certain downsides that you should consider. If you have any questions about this topic, please reach out to us at hello@aegis.law and mention that you saw this video. Thanks.